Hello and welcome. My name is Matt Taylor from Microcom Design. In this video, I will demonstrate how to quickly set up the GTX using the GTX utility to make GOES transmissions. I will be following the example described in the manual. First, launch the GTX utility. Connect to the GTX by selecting the correct COM port under Options, COM. Configure the GTX for GOES mode using the Options Preferences under the Mode tab and click the GOES option and then click OK. Click the Configure/Control/Deploy GTX button and fill in the GOES platform ID. Next, click the General Setup tab and start entering the configuration quantities. I know that we're going to need 4 internal sensors, 1 SDI12 sensor, 0 equation constants, 8 timed data parameters, 7 random data parameters, 5 random triggers, and 1 minute max average. Click the Save button. Next, click the Enable for Transmissions on Power Up checkbox, and under the Advanced menu, click the Advanced Settings, and click the Use / for null checkbox, and under the Use for Invalid Characters box, put a slash. Next, we want to change to the Transmission Setup tab and check the Time Transmission checkbox and enter the channel, interval, first transmission, and transmission window should be 10 seconds. We're going to use a bit rate of 300 bits per second, a data format of ASCII, and the data source is going to be sensors. Also click the Center Transmission in Window checkbox. Next, check the Enable Random Transmissions checkbox and fill in the channel, the interval, the randomness, and the repeat count. Make sure the bit rate is set correctly. We're using 300 bits per second, and we're going to be using pseudo-binary for the data format. We're also going to be using the sensors for the data source. Next, we want to move to the Internal Sensors tab and add Internal Sensor 0 with label Internal Temperature, or ITMP. This is going to be a type temperature. We're going to use the interval of 15 minutes with an offset of 0. Next, we want to add the rain label, which is going to be a type value. Its interval is going to be 15 minutes, and it's going to have an offset of 1 second. We're not going to log this, so we can change the log rate from 1 to 0. Next, we can add the rain count, or RCNT. Its type is going to be count, and we're going to use an interval of every 1 minute with an offset of 2 seconds, and this is going to be a delta value. Next, we're going to set up the ITMF, and we'll come back to this value later, but it's going to have an interval of every 15 minutes and an offset of 3 seconds. Now we want to set up the tipping bucket rollover count to 4,000, the multiplier to 0.25, the reset interval to daily, and reset hour to 8. Now we can move on to the Equations tab and enter the equation to change from Celsius to Fahrenheit, which is 9/5 times I0, or the temperature in Celsius, plus 32. And we want to have one character after the decimal place. Click Enter. And now we can go back to the Internal Sensors tab and select the equation 0 for that type. And we need to change his label again back to internal temperature Fahrenheit. Now I can move to the SDI12 Sensors tab. This is going to be water level, so we can change its label to WLVL. I know it has an address of 0. We want to measure it every 15 minutes with an offset of 5 seconds. Now we need to move to the min-max average tab. And set up the internal temperature to measure the min-max average, or to calculate the min-max average every 24 hours with an offset of 23 hours. "45 minutes and 10 seconds. We want to log the min, max, and average values. Next, we can move to the Time Data Buffer tab and begin filling in with the transmit battery volts. And we're going to add flags for the label and space. We also want to add the transmit forward power, and it will also have the label and space flags. Next, we want to add the transmit reverse power, and it can have the label space flags with a character turn. Next, we need to add the internal temperature. We're going to have a value count of 4 and a field width of 7 with flags, label, character turn, and line feed. We also want to add internal temperature a second time so that we can transmit the min, max, and average. And this is done by entering 0, N for the min, X for the max, G for the average. The field width for each one of those is going to be 7, and we're going to have the same flags. Next, we want to transmit the rain, which is going to have a value count of 4 and a field width of 7, also with the same flags. We also want to transmit the water level. It's also going to have a value count of 4 and a field width of 7 with the same flags. Lastly, we can transmit a text string and just use a label for that. Now we want to move on to the Random Data Buffer tab. And we need to add the trigger code, transmit battery volts, transmit forward power, transmit reverse power, and we also want the character turn line feed flags for the reverse power. We also need to add the internal temperature. That's going to have a value count of 4 and a field width of -2, and character turn line feed flags and a slope of 4. Next, we can add the rain count type. Its value count is going to be 4. The field width is going to be 2. Its flags are going to be binary wrap, character turn line feed, and its slope is going to be 1. Last, we want to add the water level. It's going to have a value count of 4 and a field width of 2, no flags, and a slope of 100. Next, we can move on to the Random Triggers tab. Add the Accumulate trigger. That's going to be for sensor rain. And the limit is going to be 0.1. Next, we can add a high. The sensor, it's going to be water level. The limit is going to be 20. Next, we can add eye temperature with a rise of 50. And this doesn't need to be transmitted, so we can do a log only. Next, we can add a fall of eye temperature, and that can be minus 30. And we also can check the log only checkbox. Last, we can add an interval transmission, which can be done every 24 hours. So that will trigger the random transmission once a day. Now we've got all that completed, we can move back to the Configurations Options tab. Click the Send Config to GTX, and click the Yes to change the configuration. Now the GTX utility is sending all the commands to the GTX to set it up. If it completes without any errors, click the Enable GTX button, and verify that the GTX is enabled by looking at the Monitor/Inspect tab, and under the GTX Information tab, looking at the transmitter state that it is enabled, and it's looking for the GPS time. You can also look at the time data buffer and see the parameters. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please call or email.